Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone listening, wherever and whenever this podcast finds you. Thanks for tuning in, and welcome to the Did You Know podcast. So today we're going to be talking to Vin about the subject of heretics and why it's important and necessary to have heretics and heretical thought within any ideology, and especially within the Bitcoin space. But first, let's talk about our sponsors very quickly. eToro is a trusted smart trading platform that's over 12 years old, predates Bitcoin, and conducts over 1 trillion in trading annually. They offer innovative tools and advanced charting features to help you be the best trader that you can be. U.S. customers can now trade the most popular crypto assets with transparent low fees. And if you're new to trading, while you're learning, you can actually practice strategies with a virtual trading tool, letting you use virtual money to test and see how your strategies would actually react in a real trading environment. You can also connect with 11 million other traders where you can discuss trading, charting, and strategies and anything else relating to trading the crypto and traditional assets on their platform. If you go to didyouknowcrypto.com/eToro, that's eToro, and you will be redirected to my affiliate link. And what that does is two things. One, it lets them know that you came through this podcast, which I'd really appreciate that, and lets them know that my listeners are, supporting my sponsors. But more importantly, for you and your pocketbook, that it will give you $50 for free, subject to some terms and conditions. There's a minimum deposit and things like that, but it's going to give you $50 in that you're able to trade, buy and sell Bitcoin and other crypto assets. So head over to didyouknowcrypto.com/eToro. And the last thing that I'll ask of you is if you head over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star and a written review. That's the biggest thing that you can do for me. I really appreciate it. Also, head over to supportmypodcast.com. Find all the other ways you can support. And if you click on the button that says supporter discounts, they're absolutely free discounts that are available to you, my supporters, and my listeners. You can get discounts for things like Trezor and KeepKey, Bitcoin wallets, Mushroom Coffee, Bitcoin tax software, and a bunch of other things that I'm constantly adding. So head over to supportmypodcast.com. And the last thing that I want to say is thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you. I truly do. And enjoy the show. I'd like to welcome Vin Armani. He's been a repeat guest on the podcast. This will be, I believe, your third time on here, and I thought it'd be fitting as well for episode 50 as well, with kind of one of those minor milestones, I guess, arbitrary numbers that we throw up there. And Vin, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, and so the genesis of this topic was kind of offline discussions that we were having. So I'd done an episode with Professor John Vervaeke and kind of my explanations of my concepts of Bitcoin and the kind of philosophical backings of it, as well as an article that I did. You'd pointed out that a lot of my thought process was very much in line with kind of the, what you kind of termed the hierarchical kind of BTC social structure or belief system, and that's a fair enough thing to point out. And as we were talking about that, you'd kind of brought up this idea of always make sure that you kind of remain almost like a heretic within your own ideology, and that you don't become constrained by dogma. And so that I thought was a pretty interesting topic, and it gave me a lot to think about, because I think that it's really easy to fall into kind of this rigidity of thought, because there is there's social points for it by people who are in that belief structure and who want other people to believe as they do, because they will validate you, and it kind of creates this kind of, I don't know, it's this community validation that is very intoxicating in a way, and it can be quite lonely, I guess, to be someone who is constantly questioning and a heretic within your own ideology. But I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on kind of your own journey in that, and why you think that that's an important thing.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. So I want to be sure before we begin this that that I'm clear that, if I say, oh, well, this particular line of thinking or this particular narrative is certainly something that belongs to this particular culture or subculture or tribe or cult or whatever you want to call it. I'm not trying to make like um, I'm not making a qualitative statement. Like, I'm not trying to say, well, that's bad, and that altogether that you should not adopt those beliefs, narratives, etc., archetypes from your culture. I mean, what's the purpose of a culture if it doesn't provide you some sort of value framework, right? Like, that's the reason why it's useful, is that we can all have some shared values. And Bitcoin itself it's a consensus mechanism, and so naturally, like, inherent is that the reason why the currency is valuable in the first place, or the reason why money itself is valuable in the first place, is because there's an assumption that we make that there's other people out there who value this thing, and therefore this is the reason why it's important for us to have it. And that doesn't matter whether you're talking about the store of value function, the medium of exchange function, or the unit of account function. They all rely on that same axiom that I believe something, and there are others who believe what I believe. I guess that for me, you could probably hear my kids in the background. They're so excited. I just got back from Australia, which kind of flows into this. So I just got back from the Bitcoin Cash City Conference, and so I've said before, and I had said before that in the episode we did about the cults, that I readily admit that I am in the Bitcoin Cash cult, and I think that a lot of people, maybe even until this conference, we also had a developers congress side by side with it. So I may sort of switch up those two terms, but they were two sort of separate parallel events. I think before that, we had been struggling, or Bitcoin Cash had been struggling to find an identity that was, let's say, outside of a reaction to BTC. And then, when Craig Wright and Calvin Ayre sort of entered in, particularly on the side of Calvin Ayre, he expended a lot of money to sort of take certain narratives and push them forward and say, these are the narratives of this particular tribe. That this is something that this man has been he's a marketing genius, right? He's a billionaire basically for his marketing more than anything else. And so they've carried that on into BSV. And so that's why they have this very sort of the narrative has been maintained and picked up by that cult, by that tribe. And so Bitcoin Cash, outside of just being, hey, Bitcoin that you can actually use for coffee, right? That culturally, that has been sort of peer-to-peer cash for the entire world. That's been the tagline, that it's got more cashness than BTC. And I think that really doesn't address the culture. And I think that perhaps until this, I think you're going to see some changes and people understanding a little bit better, because when people get a chance to get together and you sit and talk, what you start to realize about these voluntary communities is that, unlike the cultures that we're born into, and there were people from literally all over the world. All of the presentations weren't even in English. I mean, there were 3 presentations in Chinese that required an interpreter at this thing. So, literally people coming from all over the world, and you sit down and you realize, oh, everybody has voluntarily chosen this particular tribe. It's like a voluntary tribe, which is even on a greater degree than other voluntary tribes, like sports teams, where you might have, you were born in a particular city, and so therefore you follow this particular sports team. So it's even more intentional than that. There's a higher level of intent. And it was interesting sitting down, having now, when I getting involved with BTC in 2012, and starting to meet people there, although not being heavily involved in the community. And then certainly before the fork, and being involved certainly in the libertarian side of that. Then going to New Hampshire and being involved with people who were a little more agnostic, but were very early Bitcoin users. But then you had, if you had Dash, people would take Dash. If you had Litecoin, people would take Litecoin. And seeing that there wasn't the high level of coherence in the culture. then seeing BSV and seeing just how coherent that particular orthodoxy is, and to see the backgrounds of the people. Like, one of the things that I noticed about BSV that I found so interesting is what a high percentage of the thought leaders are from British Commonwealth countries. So Australia, England, Canada are so highly represented proportionally. Like, it's insane. Whereas in the other chains, they're there. Like, I mean, Adam Back is British, but it isn't like it doesn't come with the British cultural ethos as well. And so it was interesting going and seeing. I was really interested to see, well, what cult am I in? Like, who are these people? And I would say that it is unlike sort of I don't think that the type of maximalism that is in BTC could ever actually arise in BCH, because I think just temperamentally that I think the people who have flown to that side, who have decided that they are going to be in this cult, in the BCH cult, are naturally probably temperamentally much more open, and I think probably temperamentally much more agreeable as well. And so I don't think that you can get that kind of toxic maximalism, right? The celebrated toxic maximalism. I don't think that you can actually get that from a culture that is temperamentally so much that way. So, but one of the things that I found, talking about being a heretic, was that in and of itself can get out of control, and it's something that even within BCH I have. I do push back, and I think it's important for people to see that any temperament, even openness and agreeableness, can certainly get corrupted. So I think that's what we see, like social justice warriors, And so there were individuals there at this most recent conference that in the past I had engaged with a high level of public skepticism. Thankfully, they've now sort of really explained themselves. I think that they've changed some things, been a little more transparent. But there was a period of time when the big thing in BCH was to send money to these Eat BCH organizations, who were then like taking pictures that they were in Venezuela, South Sudan, some other places. It was basically like charity, like, send your money over, we're going to buy some food and take it to these people. And, I was very skeptical about that. I said, look, this can very easily we need to be a little more cognizant and conscious about this. And we need to understand that this is a very easy system to game. So literally, I mean, all I would have to do is be like, yeah, I'm going to do Eat BCH Nigeria here. Send me money. I keep half of it. I go and maybe I buy half of it and I use that for food and I take it out there. And I said, look, there's a lack of accounting here. Like, it's not tax deductible. There's I'm not saying we should have regulations, but we're not even regulating ourselves. And so I caught a lot of flack for that. And I catch a lot of flack. But I think when we talk about being a heretic, what it is to be a heretic is to have doubt in your own cult. That's what heresy is. That the doctrines and the practices of your own culture, that you question them. And the purpose, and we can talk about this more. I mean, from an individual standpoint, the purpose for doing that is because that's the only way that you yourself can grow. The moment that you say, I'm not going to question the beliefs of my culture and I'm just going to go along, you're literally an NPC. The only thing that separates an NPC from a non-NPC is the fact that they have doubt, in the program. And it's only those who have doubt in the program, because some aspect of the program is buggy, some aspect is corrupt, and some aspect is just flat out wrong. And Bitcoin wouldn't even exist if that wasn't the case. Satoshi is a heretic. And so it's first about questioning your own beliefs. And then after you've questioned and explored your own beliefs with the best of intentions of trying to grow yourself, if you find something in there, if you find a bug fix, your heresy is basically like a Git pull request. So it's like a GitHub pull request. You're like, hey, I found this bug. I fixed it. Here's the description of it, and here's the code. That can always be rejected, right? It can maybe not be put into the culture. It can certainly be debated, but at least you fixed your own programming at the very least. And so then, if people see that it's working for you, there's a much better chance that they'll adopt it to work for themselves. So it's not altruistic. It is very selfish, but at the end of the day, it's only the heretics that have ever helped to evolve the culture.
Definitely. I think that most Bitcoiners themselves, like you said, Satoshi's a heretic. So most Bitcoiners themselves would be um, heretics to an extent. There's probably some people that come in via groupthink just because they, you know, more so probably after 2017 than anything else, where they just want to find, because it's very confusing, right? You come in, especially in the last, 2 years, and there's 1,000 different coins, right? And you have to try to adopt what is your, what is the tribe that you're gonna join. And some people's tribe itself is just, I guess, spiritual but not religious, I guess, where they're just going to adopt everything. And I get more so out of a greed perspective. But within Bitcoin, that is, I mean, I would like to kind of explore that, definitely a little more, because it is, continually fascinating to watch. And it kind of makes me sad like, now that I'm blocked by Calvin, because I really did, and it was on my own doing. But I did like to watch just kind of the evolution of thought within these different groups. And yet there, within BSV, there is that, and you point that out, that is very interesting, that the British worldview, because it is very heavily British, and especially Australian, which is probably not necessarily coincidental, because of Craig's involvement. But that is very much, there's a different worldview when you talk to people, from more of a old world European mindset, than the American. I mean, and I guess, yeah. Why don't we explain or kind of explore that a little bit? How would you view the difference, um, and how that influences, say, something like BSV, the kind of European British Commonwealth mindset versus, say, the more traditional American one?
So I think that the separation that I always saw was BTC, when there was sort of the BTC BCH fork. I always really viewed that the best historical analogy would be Catholic versus Protestant. And surprisingly, like it's rather interesting that people who are practicing Catholics, or who come from sort of relatively or culturally would be like within a Catholic milieu, do seem to gravitate a lot more towards BTC. So it's like, I've talked to Giacomo Zucco about this. I've talked to you about this. There's a lot of Germans in there, you know what I mean, who are sort of at least the attack dogs, sort of in the front of the maximalist scene. And so, and I'm not trying to make a blanket statement to say that, like, oh, if you're Catholic, that's definitely it. But like Luke Dash
No, of
Jr. as
course not.
well,
Yeah.
right? It's like it's remarkable enough that it's like, that's interesting, because it's not like there's a lot of institutions, let's say, that are global, that are not religious by nature, but are Catholic forward, I guess you could say, where you look and you're like, oh, there's sure a lot of Catholics at the front of that thing, right? Or that temperamentally someone would be sort of attracted to that. And I think that there's good reason for it. I think that clearly, an orthodoxy, having an orthodoxy can be, if the orthodoxy isn't completely corrupt, it can be a key to sustainability. So the Catholic Church has been around for a long time, and it's not going anywhere. Things have changed, governments have changed, technologies have changed. The Catholic Church is not going anywhere. And that's, if you want to have a world money and you want to have a network that sticks around, maybe not a bad idea to draw in people who operate, who are used to operating within a milieu that has that level of sustainability. So for me, I mean, I actually, so like, I was baptized Catholic but brought up in the Episcopal Church myself, so still sort of, very close in terms of the rituals and everything. But when I saw that split, that questioning of the orthodoxy, I always viewed it in religious terms. And when I've seen now the split of BSV from out of BCH, and it's interesting that they attack BTC. It's very strange because BSV is actually very far in terms of their value proposition from what BTC's value proposition is. Like that they are one degree of separation further away. So it's sort of like the Mormons going after the Catholic Church, right? When the Mormons are already like a split of Protestant church and of the sort of American ideal of religion. But I do see that really what it was a split of the of basically the libertarian, voluntarist, anarchist, whatever you want to call it, and the statists. That there was a view that the state has a place within Bitcoin, and and expressed in a very, how should I say it, expressed in a very overt way. When you have Craig Wright actually saying, "I'm going to give governments the power." Literally those words in a presentation, I'm going to give governments the tools to be able to do the chain analysis and all of these things to be able to track. I was just listening to a little bit of an interview that he did recently, like just a few days ago, where he's obsessed with law and the governments will be able to seize bitcoins and miners will cooperate and all of this. And that just is, I think for most Bitcoiners, it's like, whoa, that is crazy. It's been actually quite the opposite, that even those who have decided to engage with the state, like the Caitlin Longs of the scene, like that you have had on, their whole idea has been, well, how can we carve out a little bit of space for innovation on this thing? And I think we saw from the Libra hearings, the congressional hearings, that has actually been a pretty valuable narrative, because you now even have lawmakers saying, maybe we shouldn't touch this. Like maybe we should let this space have some more innovation. Maybe we should leave our hands off of it. And so that's great. But I do think that these are all temperamental things. And when you look at, British, Australians, Canadians, you look at people within the Commonwealth, and when it comes to the state, I mean, the highest honor that you can have as a UK citizen, as a British citizen, is to be knighted, right? So it's like the highest honor that you can have is literally to have a title that says, "Oh, you are a part of this ancient lineage of the state, and now you are a permanent part of the state." Whereas you could get a Presidential Medal of Honor, but I don't really think that most people in the United States, like, I can't actually name you a Presidential Medal of Honor winner. Honestly, I can't. So and you certainly don't get to have some title before it. Nobody says, honoree. Nobody calls you honoree, whoever, like the way that they say sir and dame, I guess it is the other one. So yeah, I think that. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, as far as for the Medal of Honor, it only, I mean, outside of people who are kind of within the kind of the military cult within the United States, to that degree, it only really matters as far as for titles within the military itself. So the really interesting thing about, like, if you are like an E2, like a private first class, and you actually win the Medal of Honor, any officer, no matter what the rank, has to salute you, actually, upon meeting you. Where usually it's enlisted has to salute first. Where it's that, I mean, but but it only really matters within that, I guess, within that in group. But as far as for addressing, but yeah, that is very interesting with the hereditary titles and the sirs. I guess that's not a hereditary title with knighting in Britain, is it?
No, well, no. I mean, that's the whole point of it, right? The whole point of it is that it's conferred for your actions in furthering the goals of the state, and not just furthering the goals of the state, but I mean, let's remember, this is a monarchy that we're talking about, and so these are the individuals who stuck around, and so you would guess that there would be a split along those lines, because there was a split. Particularly if we're talking about the American experience, it was people who had a certain religious ideology who escaped from, what was the orthodoxy and the state church. But then they split up amongst themselves, and they didn't agree on everything, and a lot of them went their own ways. And so I think that that's something that we see. The problem comes not from finding a group that you have affinity to. The problem comes from finding a group that you have affinity to and then giving over your faculties of reason to groupthink. That's where the problem comes in. And it's actually the default behavior. Like, our default behavior is to take on the complete framework for reality and the value system of our culture. Most people, unless you are very, very, very fluent in two languages, and usually these are people who came up in an environment where they spoke both languages. Most people think in one language. Most people dream in one language. Obviously, if you're bilingual and you live in another country for a long period of time, then you will dream in other languages as well, the other language there. But most people's thought patterns, their understanding of what emotions are, like there are certain emotions that they say only certain people who have been raised in a certain culture with a certain religion even can feel this or understand what this emotion is. I'll blow this word, but the prime example that I've heard time and time again is a Portuguese emotion called saudade, which is basically like a melancholy almost, but that doesn't really describe it. It's sort of like a happy sadness. And all Portuguese know this emotion, but I've never had one be able to accurately describe it to me. Even those who are incredibly fluent, like at a high technical level in English, have said this is a very hard emotion to describe because there isn't really one in the English culture and language. It doesn't really exist. And so it's like that's our default that we automatically go to. And it takes a lot to question. It takes a lot to question, what is it that we believe and is it right? And the danger with that when you're dealing with software is that software is always wrong. There are always bugs and there are always improvements. And Bitcoin is software. And what we believe to be right at this given time about what the consensus rules should be moving forward, we don't have all the information. Now, thankfully, we're in an environment where forks can occur. So therefore, we do have that mechanism where people can go off and do their own thing. This is very much was true with the history of Christianity as well. But the forks have still not stopped in Christianity. I don't think the forks will necessarily stop in Bitcoin either. But I think that we're really not doing ourselves any kind of a service when we say, oh no, I know exactly what Bitcoin is. I know exactly how it should be. I know what all the consensus rules should be. We should do this. We shouldn't do this. And if we do it the way that I say, then everything will work out just fine. It's one step short of central planning. And because you happen to agree does not make it right. And so I'm much more impressed by the people. I'm much more impressed by the Krista Roses of the world. Less impressed nowadays with Daniel Krawitz because I think he's sort of playing a game. But with SV, and I understand what he's doing. And if they understood, they would understand that he's actually being a heretic as well. But I am impressed by the people who, and I try to be this myself when it comes to Bitcoin Cash, and people will see that I'm attacked even in the last month for saying things like Bitcoin is not money. Like, I've certainly been attacked by people within my own camp for that. But I'm impressed by that, by people who say, I identify with this particular group, this particular tribe, this particular cult, religion, whatever it is. And because I identify with it, because I want it to be strong, I see a bug. I want to help to fix that bug. First, I want to identify and tell you all why I believe it's a bug. Think about it, change it in my own life, show you in my own thinking how that's been beneficial to me. I have great respect for instance, going back to the Catholic Church, the individuals in the Catholic Church who have been vocal about saying, look, I'm part of the Catholic Church. I was raised in the Catholic Church. There's something corrupt here when it comes to these, the pedophilia things, I'm not leaving the church. I'm staying in the church. I'm not going to brush this under the rug, because it's valuable to me to fix this, because I get so much out of this and it has given so much to me in my life. That makes them fundamentally an enemy of a lot of people in the church that don't want to change it. And yet those are the people who have the best interest of the church at heart. That's the irony of it. And so those are the people that I have respect for, and those are the heretics.
Well, I think our first episode was actually I think it was the hash war was the first time that we talked on the podcast, and we of course talked quite a bit before then. But your kind of illuminating to me the idea of viewing Bitcoin as religion has been it just I shouldn't say it simplifies it, because that makes it seem like it's a simple answer, but it's really not. But it clarifies a lot of the things that we see, and it has been really helpful, especially when I looking at, and you kind of talked about BSV embracing the state, and that made a lot of sense to me as I saw them doing that, even though I highly disagree with that concept. But it makes a lot of sense, because there's a lot of people who feel that issue, or kind of, I should say, going back to the episode with John Vervaeke, of like, you sense something's wrong, right? There's something wrong in the world, right? And there's something wrong in the traditional institutions that we look to. Um, in the banking institution, especially kids who kind of came of age around 2008, was a really big shock to them, because you kind of grow up thinking that everything's fine, right, as a child, and everything's very stable. And even the instability doesn't seem like instability. It's just what life is. And as they kind of lost this, especially trust in the West, especially, they realized that there was a need for a change, but also it's very difficult to embrace also an idea of that there's not some sort of central figure that can distill truth to them, right? And whether or not a lot of them would disagree and say that they would look at that individual as being Craig, because now we see the Craig doesn't matter meme is kind of taking effect over the last few months. But oh, yeah, and apologies to the listeners. I had to step out. My daughter came in and wanted me to bring her back up to bed. But yeah, so there is a lot of people realizing that there's something wrong. There needs to be a change, and that Bitcoin offers that. But they're also uncomfortable with this concept of there not being that central figure, and this idea of, I don't know if you want to call it, it's not really an oracle per se, but of the state still having a role in kind of governing Bitcoin. And I can understand that impulse, because everyone's kind of gone through, as you know, especially within the libertarian mindset of where you kind of think that, where does social and a culture kind of fit into this? Who gets to dictate laws and all this kind of thing? But it's very weird to me. I mean, I don't want to necessarily drill down on this point, because it's been made out, 1,000 times over. But why would you need a Bitcoin if a court order can change the network consensus of immutability?
Right.
I don't understand that as well. But I do understand it as a good selling point for people who come into this space who go, I think the idea about Bitcoin is cool, but I'm also not crazy about fill in the blank, kind of the old tripes of the dangers of Bitcoin, because it can facilitate, X or Y or Z. But it is very interesting that they've been able to embrace, kind of hold on to the Bitcoin name, have kind of this centralized figure of importance, and almost an ivory tower, right, in which that they hold him, but then also kind of embrace people who are not quite crazy about, well, the implications of an immutable ledger, of a decentralized network. It is it's a very interesting phenomenon. And you mentioned it on past episodes about how BSC is probably one of the most, you know, interesting things in Bitcoin, even though we highly disagree with it. But
Right.
it is highly interesting to see this kind of emergent phenomenon that's being created. And it's I thought, initially that it would die out quite quickly, and it is not. Has a very strong staying power, and you see the gravity starting to pull in, certain individuals. There's people that I see getting pulled in that it's very interesting. And I see that they have, like you said, Calvin's very smart at marketing. There's people getting pulled in that aren't really at all that well versed in what Bitcoin is, but they're able to be pulled in, and this being kind of their first step, them having a very clear ideology and what they want out of it, and it being very, it's almost kind of it's a culture war at this point, right?
Yeah, and I think what the concept that you're really talking about here is about the perception in a particular culture or a particular organization around leadership. And this word governance keeps being brought up time and time again. But I think while you can have many different governance mechanisms, I actually think that what um, most of the things that are described as governance mechanisms, so whether you're talking about Dash or Decred or whatever it is, right, that are these blockchain based governance mechanisms, I think basically what they're talking about is they're talking about wealth distribution mechanism. Like let's build in something so that really it's let's build in something so the developers get paid, which not surprising that the people writing the software would think that was a good idea and then would attach a narrative to it to say, oh no, this is actually creates a system where everybody can vote on what the changes are. And it's like, do you really want somebody who has no technical understanding of this to be able to vote? Do you understand how bad of an idea that is? Like, that's a terrible, terrible way to run a software project. I think really what we have is, and I think that it's going to be one of the next crises, and I think it goes into like the John Vervaeke thing as well. And what he's talking about is uh, we don't have a crisis of leadership, but what we have is a blind spot of who is the leader right now. And this is not a new human problem. So if you look at all of the artifacts that signal leadership, it starts to become clear that human beings have always had a problem identifying who is the leader. Why does the king wear a crown? Why does he carry a scepter? Why does the Pope wear white and wear like a mitre on the top of his head and all of that gold? Why does the chief of some tribe have, this giant necklace or a headdress? Or, why do officers have different insignias on their uniform? It's not that there's any sort of crisis of leadership. The crisis is, how do we identify the leaders? So, because it almost doesn't matter what the process is for someone becoming a leader. In some ways, that's arbitrary. What's important is that once they have become that leader, whether it's through election, whether it's hereditary, whether it's through a corporate promotion, the corner office, the CEO in the corner office, you go into the building, who's got the big office, who's got the corner office, that must be the leader. Or the top floor, the penthouse, right? How do we identify the leader? And I think that, again, to sort of shout out Chris DeRose on this is something he really put me up on, and it's very esoteric, but it's the reason why he has said that the meme in Bitcoin BTC is that the meme that there are no leaders is a very destructive meme, because number one, it's just flat out false when you're talking about human organization. Whether there is some hierarchical structure for deciding who is a leader, or whether it's just an emergent phenomenon and somebody becomes a leader from small groups to large groups. I mean, this having been in the military, right? That it's like, it's not always the person with with the stripes who in any given particular situation is going to be the leader. Leaders will emerge based on competence naturally. And, in a particular situation, even the higher ranked, even an officer might, give sway or let a non-commissioned officer take the lead in many situations, right? So it's totally not uncommon for a lieutenant to defer to a sergeant in situations, especially in battle, right? Like this has just been going on for as long as militaries have existed. So, but the problem is to say there are no leaders. There are no leaders because that's you have to. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance and mental gymnastics involved to believe that, because no one has experienced that. Like as human beings, it's just simply not the case. There are leaders, and in BTC there are leaders, because I can name their names, as can you, and we'll know the same names. And BSV just threw that out the window. They started from a position of there are leaders, there is one leader, he is the leader, let us circle around him. That's a highly efficient way of operating. That's a way that human beings have been operating for a very, very, very long time. And it was interesting because Amaury Sachet, who is the benevolent dictator, lead dev of Bitcoin ABC, and some might say the sort of software brains behind the entire Bitcoin Cash fork and phenomenon in the first place, not just as a software guy, but he is a incredibly well-versed and well-read game theorist. And he comes from a Silicon Valley background as well, multilingual, very intelligent guy. And his talk at Bitcoin Cash City was actually about game theory. And one of the things that he was talking about and was about infrastructure as well, sort of a game theoretical look at some of the problems. And again, this was being heretical. He was talking about the problems that we have that we need to fix. And one of the big problems is how do we attract and retain leadership from the software world, people that we need, the very few people who are who have worked at the scale of billions of users, or billions of transactions per day and billions of users and all of these things. Amaury comes from Facebook. He worked there for 4 years, and that was what he was doing before he was in Bitcoin. So, he's saying he's worked with this tiny group of people who actually build software at that scale. And what he said was, why on earth would someone who is, for instance, at Facebook, paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, treated like royalty, given every perk and every signal of appreciation, what would motivate them to walk into a community that said, for instance, there are no leaders, and two, that what should happen is not what this expert who says, hey, this is what should be going on, that instead it's whoever's the loudest on Twitter, whoever's the loudest in Reddit. And that this person for coming into a situation and saying, actually, guys, like what you've been doing in this case is actually wrong. I'm coming from a background where I can actually tell you like what you're doing doesn't work, and it won't work over time and at scale. And then for this person to be shouted down. And yet when it goes wrong, they're the one that has to clean it up. They're the one that has to put out the fire. Why on earth would they leave from their current sort of line of work, or why would they spend time in an environment and a community like that? And so I think that that's where there's the difference, is that it's not to say that they're what BCH I hope is going towards, what I would like to see it go towards, and what I'm going to help with is it's not that there are no leaders, it's that we're trying to attract leaders, and then when people are the type of people that we want to retain, they have to be given sort of a special status in a way, and they have to be appreciated, and the signals have to be that they're being listened to. Of course, if they mess up, they need to be replaced. So, but if they're doing the right thing, the default should be to default to them, not to orthodoxy, not to a set of beliefs that had existed beforehand. Certainly not to somebody when you're dealing with a technical issue who has read Rothbard a couple of times and happens to have all the volumes of Human Action with the spine unbroken on their bookshelf, right? Like, you don't get to have a decision. And so I think that is going to be an upcoming and important difference. I think it already is a big difference between BTC and BCH. It's manifested in the fact that there are regular hard forks on BCH, and BTC's general culture is we will absolutely not hard fork. Although some of the changes that need to happen are going to need to be hard forks in the future. And so we're going to see what that looks like. And we're going to see whether or not leaders actually can emerge who can help when the inevitable happens, what I believe to be inevitable, and scale is actually needed. We're going to see what happens, and we're going to see. I do believe that there will be some heretics, and I do believe that though, if someone can step in, that they will really be a savior. But the question is, will they be motivated to be involved if they want to be involved with Bitcoin, to be involved with BTC, or BSV, right, where there's no apparent reward for them and no desire for them to be a leader. So that's going to be very interesting to see.
And that's, I think I do see that within BTC to an extent, and I do agree that as a philosophical idea, right? So you have this idea that we have no leaders. Is a interesting meme, and that it's when you try to be countercultural, but I guess there's a difference between countercultural and kind of counter historical, right? Um, and it has some power in that it's an interesting thought concept, but I think you're right that it does fly in the face of all of human history. Like, we don't have any period where, and this is kind of a misunderstanding too, when people talk about like a voluntarist culture or something like that, of well, then everybody can do whatever they want. And it's like, no, that's not at all what that means. It just it means that people will conglomerate into smaller groups, and what if they kind of have a set culture within themselves, and people that want to join that culture will do so, and whenever they want to leave, they can do so as well, without any kind of, coercive aspects of it. But I think within BTC, you do see that. I mean, obviously, Blockstream's kind of the big boogeyman in the room, as far as for they control everything or whatever, right? But there is this, with Jack, and at Square with Cash App,
Mm-hmm.
and you're starting to see that, because I mean, almost that old adage of, "He who has the gold makes the rules," right? In a way of, well, when we talk about the loudest people on Twitter, the loudest people on Reddit, they do control kind of the. I mean, it's a very niche cult, but it is the biggest, people who are actually in this, versus just somebody who bought some on Coinbase 2 years ago,
Well, it's the people with commit
people
access too, right? So that's the most
yeah,
important thing, right? It's that people who can actually change the software. That's an important point.
yeah. But I mean, I mean, we could probably discuss this here in just a second. The question of what would be the issue if there were individuals who don't have commit access, they decide to make a change, but the cultural leaders, I guess you could say, those who have the big voices on Reddit, on within Bitcoin talk and all that, and Twitter especially, if there was a split there, how would that would be interesting to see how that would work, because there is some. I think there is, like, what I was trying to get is that there is some leadership to it, and that where you see people with money are hiring individuals who have the voices, to an extent, or I should say influential voices within that community. And I think that will be a really interesting thing, is you know when people are put up against, versus, because I think a lot of people within Bitcoin are somewhat secure, uh, in being able to say what they want to, because they made an early investment. They have some money, and they can kind of do what they want for a period. But if you get to a point where a majority of your income is coming from somebody, that's when it becomes really interesting as to whether or not you're going to speak adversely of a course of action of what they're going to want to do. And I think that this is kind of the emergence of the leadership, for better or worse, within that subculture, because there is a need. This idea of, you have a decentralized network. Well, who's doing the marketing? Who's doing the messaging? And if you don't have good memes to capture, society at large, the people who are the no coiners, right? The people who are even the apostates as well, who have power, influence, or expertise that are needed, then that becomes somewhat dangerous, especially in the face of something like Libra, whether that actually takes off or not. It's really, I was saying in my weekly wrap up yesterday, was that it was really interesting that Apple, Google, and Amazon are not present within that. So they're either doing their own thing, or they're just waiting to see what Libra does and take whatever slings and arrows Libra takes. They'll follow on and be able to navigate that river a little bit better. But someone with the power of Amazon, someone with the power of Facebook and Instagram, and the pool of talent that they have to craft messages for culture and to shift. I mean, we've already seen what a Google or a Facebook can do to shift people's opinions, and media is really the power behind all that, right? If you don't have a ability to project your meme into the media, and change culture that way, I think it's very difficult to change. It's not impossible, but you see that we see massive cultural changes over the last even just 30 years. You think of, when Ellen came out as gay on her show, which was her last episode, of course. I mean, that was a big deal. That was the reason it was the last show, right? And now, if you have a show where someone, on primetime, even wanted to broach the subject of having a antithetical view of that's just not even, I mean, anything that's antithetical to that kind of worldview is just not gonna show up. That's a major change as you see within a decade. So I think that, people gravitate towards leadership, and that's just a natural thing. And you mentioned that as well as within the military, that, especially with my experience, you see with the brand new lieutenants, they actually have the rank where they actually have the ability to, as they say, pull rank and make the decision. But the individuals who actually have the competency are usually deferred to, and it's a really emergent thing. And I think we've been in this lull, for the last few years, and now we're kind of in, um, like you said, it was a build time after 2017 and the dump. 2018 and 2019 has been a lot of times that people have been building, and it's going to be really interesting to see, because I think leadership is emerging, and BSV is, like, it has totally embraced that. It's like, this is our guy, or at least for its early history. It'll be really interesting to see what happens, after these court cases kind of finalize how that ends up. But you can hold on to idealized versions of flawed heroes, I guess, if you want to put it that way.
Of course. Yeah, I think that I think that you know, and I may be wrong here, and I may have a blind spot about this, but I think that there's something that is shared by, or maybe BSV adopted this from BTC. Maybe it's just something that's shared between the two, because it's not done in exactly the same way. But one of the things that and again, I may have a blind spot on this, and if I do, either if you address it or somebody listening, if they want to call me out on what I'm not seeing here, I would appreciate that, because I would like to grow in this regard as well. But I mean, I think, you talking about these moneyed interests being sort of a source of leadership or a source of cultural values, clearly that's the case, right? So Blockstream from the BTC side, Roger Ver and Bitcoin.com from BCH, and then CoinGeek and Chain from the BSV side. Because at the end of the day, you're going to have some sort of capital to be able to push media forward. However, what I find interesting and different with the three, and I think that BTC may actually have the more evolved, the more I think they spent the money to take the more evolved path on this, and that is Bitcoin.com is what Roger decided to do was to have a media outlet. And I think now within BCH, you have smaller groups like CoinSpice who are independent and coming up, and who are, I think, more evolved in terms of their propaganda. And it's definitely propaganda, but they're geared toward a particular subset of the population, and it's got a large cool factor. So, for instance, I said that we had this developer congress at in Australia. It's sort of running parallel to the Bitcoin Cash City conference, and it was invite only, and it was limited to actual developers who had notable contributions within the community. And what I found really cool was this group of young developers who particularly seemed to be focused around since we had the May was that the May? No, it was the November. It was when the hash war happened. So the November 2018 hard fork that introduced this new opcode opcheck data sig, and which allows for some kind of cool smart contracts. And these young guys, I mean, we're talking, it seems like there's this new crop that are in their 20s, early to mid 20s, who are looking at this, and they otherwise, some of them came from Ethereum now and are moving over. And I found it very interesting because that's sort of exactly the demographic that CoinSpice is reaching out to, and, you know, calls these guys out by name specifically, right? So is celebrating them in that way. Whereas BTC via Blockstream, at least as well as I can tell, and from what I understand and from what I see, whether they have purposely done it or not, they have been much more effective at setting a framework that those quote unquote thought leaders who have a desire to be mainstreamed, so who have a desire to be sitting down in front of, you know, CNBC fast money, those people, Blockstream has been very good, like through the whole like Dragon's Den thing, through, you know, the selective censorship of Reddit, through maximalism and you know, the heavy shaming of individuals who fall out of the orthodoxy, and the celebration of like people like Anthony Pompliano, who has the most mundane, worst, and like lowest common denominator takes of probably anyone in crypto, like that mean nothing and have no value, but that are like the t-shirt or bumper sticker version of the concepts that people like, you know, that you have on your show to have long form conversations are talking about. He'll distill it into 3 words that mean nothing, but it's like, well, 1,000 likes, you know, Peter McCormick, same thing, who even admits, which I like, which is refreshing, that he's like, I actually am a complete idiot. I don't know anything about any of this. You know, I know nothing. And it's like, yay, Peter, you know nothing. Great. You know, they've been very, very good at distilling down a framework for those individuals. And that they know that if they will toe the line, that they will keep being supported that way, and that they can push their product, personal brand, books, etc., to the mainstream. And Bitcoin.com has not been good at that, and it will never be good at that, because Roger is in this for ideological reasons, and Roger is literally an enemy of the state, and Roger is literally an enemy of the banks. And although he goes on CNBC, that's not sustainable. He goes on CNBC because he has a particular history associated with Bitcoin and made some great investment decisions, but he is a heterodox heretic himself when it comes to that, because he goes on CNBC and he disses the banks who are their advertisers. And Craig and Calvin, for being who they are already not mainstream. But They are in the same way that BTC is. While BTC goes after these higher value targets, they go after the ignorant in the same way. So most of their propaganda, like you go and you read CoinGeek and you're like, oh my God, this is actually not even what happened. It's like the Fox News of crypto. But once it's like, well, but if we can get somebody to believe this and repeat it, we've got them, because they clearly have no care about introspection, reality, or any of these things. And so it does take money to do it. I think it's cynical but smart. If what you're trying to do is make number go up, then it's really smart to approach it in the way that Blockstream and the Dragon's Den and all of that has approached it. I mean, it's highly professional and very effective, great bang for the buck. But I think it's important for people who are in an environment where that's happening. And, and myself included. I mean, I've even had arguments with Roger about certain branding that he's doing on things where I was like, this is just going to make this project like immediately a target of the state. And I'm no fan of the state, but I like to quote Craig Wright, like, I'm not going to go and kick a gorilla in the nuts. If what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to see people have more economic freedom, why would I put those people in the crosshairs? So, it's different strategies approaching it. It's different strategies of how are we going to push this capital forward. And it may end up that BCH is actually hamstrung by the fact that there are so many people who are who have a certain ideology and who virtue signal around being staunch in that libertarian ideology, whereas BTC has a narrative that definitely does not ignore that, but much more importantly allows a value structure where people can actually start to bring it into the mainstream, which is highly important. So that I think that's a huge advantage, and it's going to be very hard for BCH or BSV to ever overcome that, just because the people involved in those two chains are so like ideological and fundamentalist. So it's I think it's a better use of capital by BTC, and it's also a much less conspicuous use of capital for sure.
I kind of harkening back just a bit to earlier in the conversation where you talked about kind of the large amount, I should say large amounts, but the unusually higher degree. We see people of kind of either of that practice Catholicism or come from, cultures heavily influenced by it, or Germanic, I guess, appreciation of hierarchy. And that we kind of talked about that because of my faith background, and you kind of you mentioned like, oh well, that's kind of why you appreciate BTC, and it is true that I think that that gave me a lot to think about. I think that is why I do appreciate not, I guess not, it's not necessarily hierarchy of BTC, but the fundamentals of it, the kind of purity of dogmatic belief in it. And I think that it's kind of what leads me to embrace most of the the kind of the BTC memes, I guess, as the best way forward in a way. And then I run into this issue of I do have fundamental questions with very important aspects of going forward from here with what's been proposed. And that's where I kind of fall into this issue of, yes, I embrace those memes, but also I don't necessarily embrace the groupthink of going along to get along, I guess, in a way. And it's a very a good point that you made as far as for like the way that Peter goes about that, where he's just kind of like, I'm not technical. It's kind of the meme that's most associated with him and a lot of his criticisms of it. But talking with him in an episode I did with him, is he talked about right before we did that episode, and in the episode he was going like, I don't get why everybody hates Joe Rogan, right? I've been listening to, like, of all the things I kept on hearing about him, when I actually listened to him, I really like his podcast. And I think he kind of takes that Joe Rogan approach, where Joe's whole thing is he talks to people of all different, from MMA to, mycelial structures to lost civilizations to, Alex Jones, which can cover all different topics. But his Joe Rogan's meme is, I don't know anything. I'm just a big musclehead dummy. Um, and I'm just this average Joe, which I think that's why his podcast is approachable. He's not like, I mean, I think Thaddeus Russell and, we have these kind of deep dives into a lot of topics where two people understand what they're talking about, have their place, and are important. But I think that his approach, and I think that's what Peter does very well as well, is he kind of takes this, whether it's actually true, whether he doesn't really understand it or not. I don't know another person's mental process, but the marketing aspect of, I'm going to take the persona of the average Joe and let's try to figure this out. So I can appreciate these simplistic takes. I do think that they are very effective for like people, the people that we're trying to reach, right? The average person that has heard about Bitcoin, maybe bought $50 of it, and in November of 2017 or whatever. I think that's a good marketing strategy, but I don't know. It's very difficult to try to drill down what is the best marketing strategy for trying to promote something that is antithetical, or I could say, or maybe anathema is a better term, to how we've gone about the financial structure for, I don't even know how long we've really kind of, well, since human history of having kind of a centralized source per se. There's been decentralized monies, I guess you could say, in some aspects in human history, but this is kind of a brand new thing, and it's very difficult to tell. I mean, I have my own personal thoughts on what's good marketing for these people, to get the average Joe in, but it's very difficult to tell. And I can appreciate the simplistic take, but I also think that the problem with simplistic takes is that when people start to look into it deeper, they get disenfranchised because it's not the simplistic take. Say, take Mormonism and BSV, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
is a good. Mormonism is a good one, in that, I mean, I was the only non-Mormon in my Boy Scout troop, and I still really appreciate Mormons that I know, because they are really good people and they do have a really good culture. And of course, there's problems here or there, or within those culture, that I know former Mormons as well, but they present this, and for the most part, it is pretty true that they're very cohesive, they're very welcoming, and BSV does that very well. Anybody that's like, hey, I tried, I would like to try Twitch, or I'd like to try whatever it is. People come in, they send them money, all this kind of stuff. They're very,
Mm-hmm.
very welcoming. Where I think with BTC, they focus, I think, a lot on bigger names. Like you see Russell Kung with the
That's
NFL.
right.
I think that there's a lot of embracing of bigger names. And I also I think that that's a bad way, because I think that that's, have you watched Netflix The Family, the documentary on there?
That's the about the cult, right?
Well, yeah, it's kind of, yeah, it's about the Christian. I mean, they're not quite mainstream Christian in a way, because they do embrace some very different. It's kind of an embracing of this. It's not quite the embracing of wealth, right, that you see with some of the megachurch preachers, but it's the idea of embracing leadership,
Right. Right.
right?
Yeah.
If we
I think I have. I
convert,
think I have seen this. Yeah.
yeah, it was really interesting, and I see that, looking at that, I was like, well, this is just another aspect of why Christianity is falling out, because they think this idea of, if you get the senator and the president who embraces publicly, maybe not, definitely not privately for most of them, um, your theology, that's going to change. Like that's some sort of constant, like Constantine, like we'll change the nation by getting the leader. And I don't think that that's the best way, or I don't think that's an effective way anymore. I think that with the advent of the internet, the ability to just people to look up information outside of approved sources, or as Tom Woods would say, the 3x5 card of approved opinion. I think that now that this idea of courting leaders is very old, and to go back to my own, kind of mental processes, of embracing kind of this hierarchical institution, and it's not a good way. I really appreciate actually the CoinSpice guys, their way of marketing. It really appeals to the meme culture of the 20 and 30 somethings.
For sure.
I think that's a very effective way. I don't, obviously you don't have to agree with what everybody ever says about everything, but I can appreciate highly their ability to draw on the meme of memedom.
Right. Well, Scientology is the same way that you're describing, right? They've got the Scientology Celebrity Center in Hollywood and all of that, right? That's getting Tom Cruise and he's involved with the whole thing. I think the interesting thing about Peter, to go back to the Joe Rogan example, and I think that this is where that there are no leaders meme makes an appearance, is while Joe has people on for topics that he knows nothing about, he also has people, like he does the MMA show, which he has now separated out, right? It's kind of like in the same studio, but it's different. When he has those people on, they speak at a very high level. If you're not up on MMA, it's just like, okay, I don't know who these people are. I don't know what they're talking about. But then when he'll have somebody on who is more of a public figure, but they're having a discussion about, like when he had Mike Tyson on, they'll speak at a level that can then draw you in. But the reason it can draw you in is because Joe Rogan knows a hell of a lot about that. And at times he will also school his own guests when they get off onto a topic that guest is not exactly an expert about. Like, let's say that there's some, physicist, and then he wants to talk about diet, and Joe Rogan will be like, well, actually, I had this person on and this person on. So he actually like takes in the information and he's learning the information. And over the years, he's become an expert. And I guess the brand that McCormick is using is that he's had all of these conversations, and yet he is like, well, I still don't know anything. Like, I've had all of these conversations with people. I will be in a conversation and I'll say, oh, I guess I know nothing about this. I don't really know. And it's like, man, you've been doing this a long time to be so uncurious that you really are not looking this up. Like, you don't need to know the elliptical curve digital signature algorithm to have some idea of how the consensus rules work. Like, you really don't, to go and watch a video about like how blocks are propagated and like see a little graph of that. You don't have to be a technical person to understand literally everything pretty much that's in the white paper. And you would figure that someone who's been in the space for this long and who is this far forward, I have to figure, and who's quite intelligent and articulate, which he is, there's no doubt about that. You can't take that away from him, and charismatic as well. That for me, I'm like, it must just be like that you're kind of a doofus and like, oh, I don't know anything. That must be a brand thing. It must be a brand. And if you really are so uncurious that you haven't done that, you must be doing it for the reason that you think that the show is much better if you are a doofus. Because for me, if I am constantly, like, if 2 times I'm sitting and talking with somebody about something and they bring up a topic and I'm like, okay, I don't know enough about that topic to actually like determine whether or not you're telling me the truth, I probably will go and look it up. You know what I mean? Just to be like, and I know that you're the same way on this, that it's like, let me be sure that before I give this individual a platform, that I'm not playing a part in spreading disinformation. Like, let me make sure that I'm not a useful idiot right now. And let me just be a little bit curious, whether I'm technical or not. How much of this could I actually grok? Like, how much of this could I understand before it hits the wall where I'm like, oh, I just can't understand that. And honestly, in Bitcoin, it's a hell of a lot. It's a lot. You can get pretty damn deep before you need to be a technical person in terms of the understanding of how the consensus rules work, how block propagation works, all of that, about like the different how an SPV wallet works. Like, what's the difference between being SPV and being a full node, that's downloading the whole blockchain. That's in the white paper. And it's, here are things that are coming up, and you would think that that's something that you would do. But, and this is like when you bring up the Russell Okung thing, and why the particular, and I think that this does come from out of the whole sort of Dragon's Den project, because it is a very they've had good consultancy from people who have done this at a high political level, which, why the hell wouldn't they, right? Like, this is a big boy game. This is a big boy game that we're talking about here. Like Bitcoin, I'm glad that they're approaching it that way. You get somebody like a Russell Okung, and you get somebody who comes in and you say, okay, here's the deal. There are no leaders here. There are no leaders. That's the meme. So we will celebrate you and support you and give you a platform that can make you money, that can, keep you as a celebrity, put you in a good light. Only thing you have to do is this. Here are the talking points, and speak to that. Don't question it publicly, and don't put yourself forward as a leader. Be sure that you say something, but then, we've given you this platform, so you need to give these individuals a platform who are obviously less charismatic, who are quote unquote technical as they might be, but who are the approved, here's the approved slate of individuals that you can bring onto the platform with you. Now remember, they're not leaders. They're still not leaders, but they're just a little more knowledgeable than you. And the secret there, the greatest trick that the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he didn't exist, is those are the leaders. Those are the actual leaders. Except they're saying that they're not leaders as well. And so that's the trick. And it's a beautiful and wonderful trick. And it's the trick that's played by politicians in the United States, where they're like, oh, I'm a public servant. It's the will of the people that this happened. They elected me. My constituents elected me to come here and represent them. And, anyone with half a brain knows that that's not what's going on. They're representing their own interests and the interests of their donors. So yeah, I think that that's when there are no leaders gets dangerous, because if there are no leaders, then you have no responsibility to know what the hell you're talking about. And it's only, people like yourself, which is why I say in many ways you are very much a heretic, in that, you do question, you do want to know more. I think that when you move forward, that you are, I would tend to think that in doing 50 episodes that you are more knowledgeable now than you were 50 episodes ago. And I think that that's exactly how you move culture forward. You've got to have people doing that, but then you have to acknowledge that they are leaders, and you have to reward them for that as well.
Yeah, I've considered redoing my initial, because I did like the first like 7 episodes trying to sadly explain concepts in the space of like, what is a blockchain, what is Bitcoin, right, what is a wallet, and I thought they would be evergreen episodes that I could link to in the future when we talk about higher level stuff, and going like, well, if you don't know what a blockchain is, refer to this episode. And I recently was kind of re-listening to what I had put down on in audio on that, and I was a bit dismayed at my even my level of understanding at that point. And I realized, like, I try to say, like, I've been in Bitcoin since like it was like late 2012 2013. I started to like hear about it, and I was mining all these various, and then Litecoin, and then all the other altcoins, right? But I really didn't understand it. I really did not start to understand it until eh, when I started doing this podcast, and I started to have to go like, okay, well, I don't want to, sound like a rube, and I need to start to research things. And then as I started to for each guest and talking about different things and looking at that, like it's completely changed, from year to year and month to month on my understanding of all of this. And that's I don't know, that's one of the things that keeps me impressed and in, I guess, to use an emotional term, in love with Bitcoin, is that it constantly forces you to learn, you know uh, the broader, and permaculture concepts of the idea of, um, the edge effect, right? The edges are where you see the most growth, right? So any kind of permaculture system, if you have like a food forest, something like that, the edges of that system are where you see the most growth.
Mm.
And so as I start to explore the edge effects of Bitcoin, I understand Bitcoin better, and I understand, more of its implications and things like that. And yeah, I would embrace that concept of heretic, and at times it would be much better for myself in terms of gaining followers and listenership, and then in turn monetary benefits, right? Because as you know, as a podcaster, the more listeners you have, the more valuable your words are for an advertiser, right? So it makes it a lot more valuable if you have that. So it's a lot more valuable and profitable to actually, in the short term, I guess you'd probably say, to fall in line, to be embraced by a larger culture versus just kind of keeping yourselves at the fringes. But it's been, it's it's difficult, and but it's also very rewarding at times, or most of the time, I should say, just by getting to learn from different people. I'm not trying to, like, shit on Peter or anything like that, but I was taken aback a bit by when he said, like, he never even set up his own node. And I'm not embraced at any level for the most part, by even though I like I said, I fall mostly, a lot of the memes that I embrace are in the BTC side, but I'm not embraced by those people for the most part. But I mean, I've had my own full node. I run it on an old, I think it's an old like ThinkPad, Lenovo ThinkPad or something like that. That I'm running, and I was kind of taken aback by somebody who'd, you know been involved that long, had not actually set up their own thing like that. So I don't know if he actually, going back to marketing. I think that at first I was like going like, what the heck, you haven't done that. But then I also wonder, like, that's a very useful marketing term or a marketing ploy, right? Because
Hmm.
then you could turn it into, oh, well, I haven't done this, and let me explore this and do it for the average person, which it's had, at least from what I've been able to view on Twitter, it's had good success. People really embrace that and like, oh, well, this is helpful, and I'm able to do that. And I think anybody that runs kind of that marketing, and Calvin would is a good example as well, is very good at kind of turning either a real or false, uh, falling down on their part into a good piece of media and content to put out.
Well, it's the
I think
preacher
that
who
those are
gets
very
it's the
useful.
the mega church preacher who gets caught cheating on his wife, right? And then has the tearful come to
Right.
Jesus
Yeah.
moment, and like is we're all sinning, like the Jimmy Swaggart, we're all sinners and blah blah blah, all that. It's the same thing.
Yeah. It's very effective. I mean, because people can relate to it, right? And I think that in the 21st century, I think people appreciate humanity and the failings of humanity more than they, to a very topical way. I think that it's very topical where you can get a lot more likes, a lot more eyeballs from saying, like, I'm a fallen person in whatever niche that you're in, and here's my journey. Right? People really appreciate that. But I also think that there is a draw, or maybe that's just my own background as well, to kind of uh, purity, of not purity, but of I'm trying to think of the word, would be of just kind of like that line in the sand that's not crossed, like that person that's like, I will not betray my own principles. I think it's Sopranos, like they talked about very early on in the episodes when you're seeing a psychiatrist, what happened to and not Cary Grant, but I can't remember the actor they talked about, the strong silent type, right? We have this idea of like, of what we want to embrace and who we want to emulate.
The ideal
We
Bitcoiner,
have that.
right? The ideal Bitcoiner.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and you guys had that talk as well, the ideal Bitcoiner, and we all want, whatever walk we're in, we all want to be that ideal Bitcoiner, and we want to emulate that. But is there really an ideal Bitcoiner?
Probably not. Probably not, man. I mean, well, there is. We all have to carry around an ideal. The question is, do you know what the ideal is? Because you're moving towards something for sure, right? The simple fact that someone believes this is right and this is wrong naturally means you have an ideal. You have an ideal of everything. I mean, this is like the Platonic idea of like the Platonic solids, right? The reason that you know that that this is a square is because you have some idea of an ideal square or circle or hexagon or octagon or whatever in your pentagon in your head. This is not a perfect approximation of it, but it's like a slice of pizza is not a triangle per se, but it falls within the ideal. And I think that that's really, it's us coming to a realization and saying, okay, what is the ideal? Who is the ideal Bitcoiner that I am following after? And being introspective about that. And first off, being able to articulate the ideal, because that's going to help you follow it in the first place, whichever direction you want to follow it. But then looking at the ideal that you have and saying, oh, wait a minute, there's this piece here that is I actually don't like. Like, I need to switch up my ideal because I actually looked at it and I saw it. Now let me switch it up because I do believe that the ideal Bitcoiner does X, Y, Z, right? Like, whoa, I do believe that the ideal Bitcoiner actually would pay for coffee with Bitcoin. Like, I actually kind of do believe that. And if you don't believe that, then why would Lightning be valuable, for instance? Right? So it's like, I think that BTC has a bit of a crisis because there's cognitive dissonance in the memes of like, ooh, I'll send you one Satoshi on one side. So I set up a situation where I'm going to send you one Satoshi, which is literally worth nothing. And then there's been a meme that says, well, Bitcoin is not for buying coffee, which is actually worth something. And so I think that those people who are heretics, if any culture is to be saved, this is the whole idea of the hero's journey, is that the hero is really kind of always a heretic. And they're the ones that go out into the wilderness, they or within their own culture, and fight against that. So while you may have a hero who's an external hero who goes out and is a conquering sort of Promethean idea of goes up on some mountain and gets the fire and brings it back, you also have the internal heroes who show us the problems with our current ideal within ourselves, the Gandhis and the Martin Luther Kings, etc. Those are the people that tell us what we ourselves are doing wrong. And they start out by saying what they themselves are doing wrong and to change themselves. And those are the heretics, but those are the only people that keep the culture healthy. Without those people, the culture falls into decay, because those little things that were inconsistencies are the things that bring down the Tower of Babel, right? You want to be, if you're going to build a tower to the sky, which is your culture, you need that to be on a firm foundation. And firm foundations are logically consistent set of beliefs. It's as little inconsistency as you possibly can have, just like you would want. Inconsistencies in the stone are going to make it more weak. Inconsistencies in your ideal are going to make you more weak. And so that's the heretic. Like the heretic is, it's a shamanic practice, right? We don't need to go into all of that, but I mean the idea of that curative, the witch doctor, that whatever it is that is an adversarial person to the culture. They are not even accepted as a normal person within the culture. They have to go and live off in some cabin in the woods, right? The witch, the old lady who has who can actually cure the diseases, the problems. When your kid gets sick and is about to die in the middle of the night, like you trundle the kid up back in the days of the rural village, and you carry them out to the old witch who lives in the woods, because she's the only one who knows the old secrets and the ways to fix things. And you do that in secret, right? Because you can't be seen to be going out there, to be going out to that heretic, that witch, that non-believer. But you know that it's the inconsistencies in the beliefs within the village that's made it so that they can't cure your child. And so if you care about your health, your mental health, if you care about the health of the community moving forward, at some point you've got to embrace some of that, and then you got to bring that back and to let it change you. And I think that should be, for me, that's always been the reason to do podcasts, to do interviews, to create my own content. It's been as much about my own discovery and ability to set aside some time to question my own beliefs and to learn more from other people. And I like I say, I think you've approached it that way. And I think it's about quality over quantity, because I would wager that the quality of individuals as a whole who listen to your content is way higher than the individuals who just want to keep being told what they already know.
Well, I appreciate that. I would hope so. So, it's always difficult to try to figure out, as far as for the I try to basically just do this as things that I find, and who I talk to as people I find interesting, or things that I want to learn about. And it is difficult to try to reach out. And admittedly, I am attracted to the orthodoxy, as I've mentioned a few times. And he talked about with the what we talked about with American and kind of European backgrounds, and you talk about kind of the Germanic Catholic backgrounds, as well as people in BTC. I was just thinking, I'm wondering if the kind of English is, especially American English, more so than anything else, is more adaptive and kind of fluid in slang than a lot of other languages. I remember talking to people that understood English from other countries, especially those who learned, the Queen's English, and being completely floored at the amount of slang that we constantly have in American English. And I'm wondering if that's also just kind of a reflection of kind of this American heretical thought towards, historically, although I think that's becoming less so over time, towards kind of these ideas of boundaries and what is allowed and what is not, and compared to, like, something like German, or something that's I mean, of course, these languages evolved over time, but they are very rigid. And I learned Russian in high school and then in college, and it's very different from the old Slavic, but it is a very rigid language. There is quite a bit of slang that has come in, more so after the wall fell, more than anything else. But it is very interesting to kind of think of when you think of uh, traditional verbal language as influencing the mindset, and then now, as we see more and more, the digital languages becoming pretty much what we actually interact with more than actual verbal language on a daily basis, and how those actually influence us in our culture, without our really acknowledging it. And I'm wondering how that influences us, and the kind of the language of Bitcoin is going to influence, culture over time, and the different languages of different, variants of Bitcoin are going to change kind of these subcultures. But we should probably actually save some of those
Sure.
discussions for a later
Sure.
date. I know that you've been, you know, you're probably quite tired.
A little
You've
bit. Yeah.
traveled across half the No, you travel halfway across the world, and I appreciate you kind of doing this last minute interview request that I kind of did this that I asked of you, and so you can get back to your family and spend some quality time. But I really like to thank you for coming on, and I always really enjoy our discussions. It always gives me a lot to think about, and it kind of keeps me I guess heretical, to say the least. But for those who haven't listened to the earlier episodes, I will link to those in the show notes at digiknowcrypto.com/EP50. That's EP for episode 50, EP50. How can people get a hold of you, follow you, see what you're up to?
So vinarmani.com, if people want to go back and look at some of the content and podcasts that I've done over the years, or check out my books as well, is there. I'm mostly active on Twitter, so I'm very, very active at Vin Armani, and I love having back and forth discussions with people. So if people want to jump in, I think now is actually kind of a really interesting, and if you approach it right, kind of fun and entertaining time in crypto Twitter. Like it's there's still animosity, but I do feel like it's much more now almost like sports teams, and so it's a little more interesting that people are able to decide for themselves what community they want to be a part of. So yeah, at Vin Armani, I spend most of my time doing crypto Twitter stuff, and cointext.io is my company. So people can go and check that out as well and use cryptocurrency via SMS. And we support BCH in 40 countries, but we also support BTC in the U.S. and Canada. So people in the U.S. and Canada, please go check it out.
Well, thank you again, Vin, and appreciate it. And we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks a lot.